We are live. Welcome to New Atlas Live. I'm Brian Berletic. Joining me, as usual, is my friend and colleague, Angelo Giuliano. I hope, Angelo, you had a Merry Christmas. We're kind of in between holidays. New Year is coming up. I think it's pretty much back to work for me. I don't know about you, but how were your holidays? I hope everyone had and is having a good holiday.
All great. The world, everything, those conflicts don't take any break. So it's important to be always updated. And I'm glad just to join you on between Christmas and New Year, and we can talk about what's going to be about to next year. I mean, how do you see next year the development, especially with Trump being the new president? Any changes, or maybe shift? Maybe we might want to talk about the shift, probably a shift towards Southeast Asia and China, and the resolution of the conflict. We have two major conflicts. The largest, the biggest one, and the most sensitive is Ukraine, and then we have the Middle East. So how do you see the transition, Brian?
Well, right before we went live, we were talking about how we went from 2023 into 2024 and how we were talking about October 7th and how that was going to set the stage for a wider war in the Middle East. This year, we saw that now take place. And because of the collapse of Syria, the stage is now set for war with Iran. So this is going to continue advancing. The United States, its proxies in the region will continue setting the stage for now focusing on Iran. They're working on Yemen as well. I think there's some unfinished business in Iraq. I don't think the U.S. is happy with the way Iraq has been going, the amount of influence Iran has, simply because the people in Iraq and Iran have mutual interests. They don't want to be occupied and squatted on by someone from the other side of the planet. And of course, the other big transition, again, we were talking right before we went live, is we have this war with Russia in Ukraine, but there's this urgent need to address China. China is not just rising; it's accelerating as it rises. I was just looking at just a couple of, I don't know if you follow, Angelo, the high-speed rail system in China, but they expanded it to something like 47,000 kilometers. There's one line that has serviced 400 million passengers this year. That's more passengers than there are people in the United States. And they've just unveiled a new prototype that I think has an operational top speed of 400 kilometers per hour. That's pretty fast. So they're advancing in every way. That's just one example. And the United States, we were actually, maybe this could be the first, because we're talking about Trump coming in and people are saying, maybe this is a big opportunity for change, but I think no, the change, but only in a bad way. Change in the sense that the U.S. feels like it's running out of time, so it's going to shift gears and accelerate. There is no reverse gear, as Alex and Alexander say on the Duran all the time. How about? Hold on a second. I gotta add. Should have done this beforehand. Hold on a second. Share screen. Entire screen, this one. Okay, sorry about that. So this is Trump's defense policy pick. Once said, TSMC can't end up in Chinese hands if China takes Taiwan. And by the way, Taiwan is already part of China. It's internationally recognized as Chinese territory. Even the U.S. officially recognizes Taiwan as an island province of China. But they play this double game where they're promoting separatism in the administration in Taipei. And so Elbridge Colby, I've seen him for years now on X, before that Twitter, anti-China war hawk. He will not tolerate a rising China, simply because he believes the US is inherently superior and no one is allowed to surpass the United States. And this is a deeply ingrained belief all across Washington. Angela, what about some thoughts you have on Elbridge Colby before we get into this too much further?
Well, when you look at his background, he's pretty much from the school of thought of Mersheimer. So Mersheimer is not necessarily, he's not pro-peace. He's actually very pragmatic, and he's it's what we call the realistic school, that says that clearly the US cannot fight on many fronts at the same time. It doesn't have the capacity to do that. And there should be a shift towards the main adversary of the US, and especially when it comes to economy, because ultimately it's about money, because money is power. And the problem that China has is nothing new. It's the same. It's very similar to China, the problem it had with the British Empire when you had the Opium War. So China had a trade surplus, massive trade surplus, because it was exporting ceramics, silk, mainly to and tea, mainly to the British Empire, but it wasn't buying much, and basically China was accumulating silver, because silver was the main money back then. And so what did the British Empire do was to impose opium upon China. And then at some point, China didn't want to accept this opium, and it attacked China. And this is when this new colonial era happened. This what the Chinese like to call the century of humiliation. So what is happening right now is very similar. You have China that has a very large trade surplus against the US and also most of the world. And you have the US that has turned into a financialized economy. So it's not the real economy. When you look at the GDP, it's all inflated figures, because it's not tangible goods. It's all services. It's all inflated. And it's been prosperous upon, because it's backed by a very strong army, and because it has imposed upon the world the dollar hegemony. So what we're living here is that you have, going back to this Thucydides trap, you have an emerging power and declining power. And now the US is panicking, because China, when it comes to GDP in purchasing power parity, has a larger economy than the US. But additional to that, when you look at the real economy, China is much more industrialized than all Western countries combined. So it's very worrying for the US. And what they will do, what they're trying to do when it comes to this shift towards China, is how we can prepare a war, but a proxy war, because the US doesn't have the capacity to be there to have a strong presence. It needs actually a few countries out there. We talk about South Korea, Japan. You have Australia with AUKUS. This trilateral alliance that the US has been trying to impose upon Japan and South Korea. It's called JACUS: Japan, Korea, and the US. Then you have the Philippines. They're trying to steer problems there, border problems that actually under Duterte was a status quo. It was fine. You have actually all the countries in the region have border disputes, because it's very difficult. And then, even Canada and the US has border dispute with, between themselves. And in addition to that, you have always the problem of Taiwan. How can they do that? There's many ways to do that. And you have the games of alliances, same as World War I, when you have those alliances. And if one country goes into confrontation with China, then maybe, let's say Japan goes into confrontation, Taiwan goes into confrontation with China, which, by the way, is the same country. But then there's a game of alliance that Japan actually, they did a reinterpretation of their constitution, that they could come at the help of Taiwan. And then you have this alliance that they're trying to build between South Korea and Japan, that would mean that South Korea, which is an army which is controlled by the US, could come at the help of Japan. So you see, it could trigger an escalation. And ultimately what the US would do would be to bring support, maybe finance, lend-lease agreement, which, by the way, actually they already have for Taiwan some prepared bills for lend-lease agreement, which are very similar to what they did for Ukraine, similar to what they did in World War II. So you see, they've been preparing that for a long, long time. So many different scenarios, but it could come from Taiwan. It could come from South Korea. You see what happened between South Korea and North Korea? It's very similar. There's a martial law. there was a false flag they wanted to do between South Korea and North Korea. And because South Korea's army is actually under the command of the US and the time of war, but in reality, de facto, South Korea and North Korea are still at war. So this army is under control by the US. So the martial law and a false flag would mean that the US could use South Korean army to fight North Koreans. So you see that types of escalation, and then you have this alliance between North Korea and Russia, and you would have China, which would never accept to have North Korea to be attacked by Western-led alliance. You see all the scenarios possible that could lead to an escalation in the region. It's massive, and it's more real than what you could imagine. This is why right now, if you look at Taiwan's politics, the Kuomintang is actually pushing for a law to be much more in control of the martial law enactment, because in reality you could have a false flag, and the current president in Taiwan would actually take all the powers, and once you have a martial law, you are in de facto in a position of dictatorship, and you could be in a position like Zelensky. Everything is shut down. There's no more opposition. There's no alternative voices, and you are in control. And you could be de facto actually declare independence, bypassing all the will of the population of Taiwanese population. So you see, so this is I think people need to start looking at that region, even though this a lot of things can still happen in Ukraine, in the Middle East. But I think the focus, you and we are very soon going to have to focus gradually more towards that region.
So you laid out quite a bit there, Angelo.
So it's a lot.
Yeah, but this is something that we talk about in detail, something we've talked about in detail for years. The US did a very similar thing all across Europe. The political capture and then use of these countries and then the entire region as the European Union as a proxy to aid the US to project power, to amplify its own power. And it does it entirely at the expense of Europe. Europe is not benefiting from this at all. There's a small circle of interests that benefit. Everyone else does not benefit from it. They're suffering from it, and they're watching their countries and the region suffer irreversible decline because of it. They're doing the exact same thing all across Asia. They have politically captured Japan, South Korea, the Philippines to almost completely, and they have been reaching into Southeast Asia with the National Endowment for Democracy. This is something that we've been talking about for years, trying to not just overthrow the governments here in the region, but they're also manipulating, brainwashing, conditioning the population to very gradually turn against their own best interests, just like the US did in Europe, convincing people to hate Russia for no reason at all, no real reason, just because it serves US interests. And they hate Russia to such an extent that they are destroying their own country in the process. So this is what's going on in Asia. And you were just talking about realism, Angelo. And I would say a realist would understand that a rising China is inevitable. It has 4 to 5 times the population, largest industrial base on earth. Angelo, you were talking about industry versus the West's service economy. We've talked about the number of STEM graduates, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, millions more every year than the United States. And it's not just because they have a bigger population, it's a bigger percentage of the population also. And so this is going to happen. If you're a realist, you would accept that this is inevitable and that trying to stop something that's inevitable is illogical. It's not realist. It's not rational. It's not reasonable. It's unreasonable, and it's going to do as much harm to yourself as it is to everyone else. The United States is in such a position right now. We could see them doing the exact same thing in their proxy war with Russia through Ukraine. We'll get into that here in just a moment. They're going to their only option really is to destroy. They cannot beat Russia. They cannot beat China. So you see what they're doing. They cannot beat Iran outright. So what are they doing? They're just destroying everything. They've destroyed the Middle East several times over. They are destroying Europe, and they are setting the board, as you were describing, Angelo, to destroy Asia, which again comes back to someone like Elbridge Colby. Everybody is holding their breath, waiting for Trump to come in and save the day. He has packed his cabinet with warmongers, neocons, and people like Elbridge Colby who wants to literally blow up factories rather than allow China to get a hold of a factory that's already in Chinese territory. It's insane. It's insane. And if you're waiting for people like this to save you, you're in for a big disappointment. Now, what are some, Angela, you've warned about this quite a bit, about Taiwan, that the current administration declaring independence from China. That is a huge problem. And I think what we've seen this year, since we want to talk about things this year that might affect next year, is the continued support for separatism by the US to Taiwan. We watched them sell huge amounts of weapons to Taiwan. Realistically, what difference is that going to make? These are the same weapons that are failing to perform in Ukraine. So what good are these weapons going to do Taiwan, which is much, much smaller than Ukraine? Are there any other incidences in Asia this year that you think are going to significantly shape next year, Angela? I want to show people just how much smaller Taiwan is. Go ahead.
It's a smaller scale, but we've covered, you and I, we've covered Myanmar. I think there could be an escalation there, and I think for China this is a very critical place. Also, I would say that, and this is further down, the road. There could be a blockade. This is one of the risks that we have, and we mentioned this quite a few times on the Strait of Malacca. You could have a blockade very similar to what the US did in before Pearl Harbor, and to strangle Japanese economy. They would do that for China, because you have, I think there's probably 30 to 40% of Southeast Asia's trade that is going through the Strait of Malacca. And by the way, Myanmar is actually one of the countries that helps China to bypass this Strait of Malacca, because there's a pipeline. They're actually going through Myanmar that and to Kunming in China, and China needs that. So that's one of the risks, and this is actually one of the reasons that there's the Belt and Road Initiative, is to have inland roads as alternative to sea roads. But I think also we've seen when it comes to the supremacy of the US, the Western powers, they were mainly because on the sea. The projection of power, and especially having larger fleets and many army bases around the world. But now I think, and you are probably much more, you probably the person to talk to when it comes to that. We've seen through Ukraine war, we've seen huge changes that actually make some weapons obsolete right now, right? Does it make sense to have a large fleet as it used to? And now we have hypersonic missiles, and I would say the drones. How does it actually changes completely the game now? How do you see that when it comes to confrontation in the Southeast Asia?
Well, any war between the US and China, the United States itself is admitting they don't have enough missiles, they don't have enough ships, they don't have enough aircraft, they don't have the industrial capacity to replace anything that is lost. They have built a military over several decades now that are meant to basically bomb and obliterate more or less defenseless people in devastated nations starved out by sanctions, destroyed by U.S. proxy war and U.S.-sponsored terrorism. They don't have a military that is designed to fight a peer or near-peer adversary. And we could see how poorly the U.S. and Europe are doing training, backing the Ukrainians against Russia. And we remember all of the things that they were saying about the Russian military in the beginning of the special military operation. And we can see how all of that has shifted. And it's not, people are listening to us instead of them. They're admitting it themselves about all of this. So if they don't have enough missiles, air defense systems, artillery rounds, vehicles to go to war with Russia in Ukraine. They certainly don't have the ability to do this against China. I just want to show people. I know you know that. I know everyone knows this, but this is where the United States is on the map. And this is where China is on the map. So the U.S. is trying to project military power all the way across the entire Pacific Ocean. All of these incidents that they have with China, where they complain about China intercepting their warplanes or coming too close to their ships, all of these planes and ships are operating out of countries in the region because it's literally too far away from the U.S. to operate from U.S. territory. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Angela, you were talking about the Strait of Malacca right here. There's also the South China Sea. I want people to see this. This is a U.S. government, arms industry funded think tank, and they're talking about how much trade goes through the South China Sea. And you can see it's mainly China and its trade partners in the region. And all of these countries count China as their largest trade partner. So when the U.S. is talking about China threatening trade through the South China Sea, it's Chinese trade. So they're obviously not going to threaten their own trade. So why is the U.S. actually putting its military there in the South China Sea? To disrupt Chinese maritime trade. As a matter of fact, again, going back to the map here, the U.S. is placing its military here in the South China Sea, in the Philippines. They obviously have a presence in Japan and Okinawa, also in Taiwan. They don't talk about it, but they do. And then they have a presence in the Middle East, where China gets most of its hydrocarbons, and they're in the process of destabilizing and destroying the Middle East. So this is meant ultimately to disrupt the flow of hydrocarbons to China. Now, Angelo, you talked about Myanmar, which is right here, and there is a pipeline and other infrastructure that runs through Myanmar from the ocean to Kunming. And that is, again, as you said, to circumvent having to do this trip through the Strait of Malacca all the way to China. It's a shortcut. They also have one in Pakistan, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which goes from China all the way down through Baluchistan, southwest Pakistan. The U.S. has terrorists there that literally attack and kill Chinese engineers. They attempted to kill the Chinese ambassador to Pakistan. And so everywhere there's Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure, the U.S. has armed terrorists attacking it. So from the Middle East, where the U.S. is destabilizing the region, occupying it militarily, to terrorists from the Middle East all the way to Asia, attacking Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure, to the U.S. Navy, setting the stage to interdict Chinese maritime shipping. You can see the type of conflict that is taking shape. They don't necessarily have to fight a direct conflict with China. They could attack and attempt to disrupt Chinese maritime shipping and cripple its economy that way, which is why it's so important to keep a close eye onto what the U.S. is doing to Russia right now, who is circumventing U.S. sanctions. We just had, let me see if I can find it, Finland. Finland just seized a Russian ship. It's an oil tanker. They claimed that it was cutting sea cables or something like that, just some ridiculous pretext to justify what was something we knew the U.S. was desperately wanting to do all along. They imposed sanctions on Russia, and Russia circumvented them. So then they began thinking of what to do next. And I remember all the way back in 2022, people talking about blockading Russia, blockading any ship carrying Russian oil. Angela, I think you might remember that. And so this is a prototype for what the U.S. will eventually do to China once it shifts from Russia to China. And whatever they're able to do or what they're not able to do is going to shape the way this next part of this conflict unfolds. Angela, you have any thoughts on this Finland? Again, a politically captured country. The U.S. has politically captured it and turned it against its own best interests. Now they're using them as a proxy against Russia to do this, which the U.S. itself it would have been a hard sell for the U.S. to just openly begin blockading Russia. So they get their proxies to do it. They get their proxies to suggest it and to start doing it. So it doesn't look like it's the U.S. to make it look like some sort of consensus is taking place rather than the U.S. Using Europe as a proxy, essentially. Angela, have anything you want to add to that?
Well, it's a very sad story. It's very dramatic what Finland is doing. Remember, Finland after World War II, it had become neutral, so it had a long-lasting peace with Russia, and it actually never joined any bloc. There was two blocs. There was NATO. There was a Warsaw Pact. So it was non-aligned. It was pretty much like Switzerland. And then probably there's a typical hijacking of a democracy, and also the fact that Finland is part of the EU. The EU was a CIA project to destroy nation state and to put all Europe into the US umbrella. And you see right now, actually, the trend is that there's this actually integration, even in terms of military. So when you joining the EU, you de facto join NATO. So they've been hijacking Finland's democracy, and now you have Finland, which is actually acting against its own interest. Peace was working well with Russia. It was not about alignment. Now they have a huge border with Russia. They had peace since World War II, and now they are actually antagonizing Russia by seizing a Russian ship. And so you see Finland being used against its own interest. So it's very sad, and I think this episode is about triggering an increase of NATO presence in the Baltic Sea. So what they want to do is, as our colleague from the Duran said, they want to create the Baltic Sea as being a NATO sea. And in reality, this is extremely strategic. I don't know if you remember, they were actually even talking early on in the war. This special military operation was to do a blockade on Kaliningrad, and this was a suicide too. And actually, the backtrack, and I think there's another escalation there. But again, I think those are attempts, and I think it's not the first time that they're trying to escalate, to provoke Russia, and it didn't work for the last 2 years. On the ground, everything, all the fundamentals haven't changed. 2 years ago, we had those discussions 2 years ago. It was not about following the war on a daily basis. It was about just checking all the fundamentals. All the fundamentals were in favor of Russia, and Ukraine had de facto lost. The only way that Ukraine could win, and not even win, you cannot win against nuclear power like Russia, but I would say to create more damage would be to have NATO to join in. So the fundamentals were always there. It was about extending Russia and to damage Russia, and maybe to hope for regime change, which everything they tried to do didn't work out. You have Russia now, which is absolutely not isolated. On the contrary, we see with BRICS, there's Putin is probably one of the most respected leaders in this I would say non-Western world. Russia is a very solid economy, extremely industrialized. They actually outperform in terms of industrial capacity, military industrial capacity, all NATO countries combined when it comes to artillery and to building missiles. And again, they tried again to extend Russia into this Syrian trap, which Russia didn't fall into that trap. And so again, I think now it's about how they are going to resolve this war, and we are going to go through a face-saving phase, because the US cannot afford to lose face there, and Putin needs to have a long-lasting peace. Again, this is going to be an Istanbul Plus agreement, and a long-lasting peace. That's I doubt that they'll go back to a Minsk III. This needs to last for long time.
Yes, well, I agree. This is what's going on in Ukraine is a strategy by the U.S. to overextend Russia. And I would say it hasn't worked out the way I think they thought it would, but it also isn't entirely true that Russia isn't being overextended. It is. I think if they could have held on to Syria, I think they would have wanted to, and they simply weren't able to. And we're looking at the conflict in Ukraine. I think if Russia could, they would want it to move along a lot faster than it is. It's not benefiting them to drag it out longer. If they could wrap it up quicker, they would. They simply don't have the ability. But it is true that they are outproducing the collective West. It is true that for years and years before the special military operation was launched, they were building up their ability to be self-sufficient economically. They knew the sanctions were coming, just like China knows the sanctions are coming, and they try to delay it for as long as possible. But all along, they're creating alternatives, and they're looking for ways around it. They're looking for ways to mitigate this advantage that the U.S. otherwise would have over them. So that is definitely a factor. This seizing of this, well, someone in the comment section pointed out the seizing of this Russian tanker. I have not seen Russia so far. Maybe they have responded to it, but I haven't seen Russia respond to that. So we have to be careful and make sure that this is actually a Russian oil tank. This is an entire. There was another question in the comment section asking, like, how do we know what is real and what is not real? You really have to wait for it to be confirmed. Usually, if something is true, you will see all sides of any particular conflict in one way or another agree that this happened. They might have a different version of the story, but they'll at least agree that it's happening. So if there's this news story gaining traction and one side isn't even saying anything at all about it, just wait and see, well, what actually turns out to be the story, because we've seen this before too on many occasions.
Yeah, and it's probably they make it a big news, and when everything actually there's an investigation and so on, they don't come back to the same media and say that actually this was nothing. It was a non-event. But it's very interesting how they after, I don't know how long did it take. I mean, Nord Stream 2, the Nord Stream terrorist attack on that happened. It's still unsolved issue. So now we know whom he benefited and who's probably behind that.
Yes.
And now we have this cable that was just broken, and they come up with those stories about ghost ship, and supposedly the anchor it's missing an anchor. Supposedly this ship is missing an anchor, and that anchor might have cut down the line, but they already have the solution. They have everything since, and this biggest actually terrorist act on infrastructure ever in world history that happened. We still don't know. So it's interesting how they jump into they come up with those stories, and it reminds me actually the story about 10,000s of North Koreans be fighting against Ukraine. We have thousands and thousands of drones. They say that those Koreans are human waves. You don't even have a footage of a human wave. You don't have even a clear picture of a North Korean. And the only one North Korean that they actually captured, he happened to die right after. So. But the problem is that average Joe, sadly, you have, I don't know what's the percentage that actually still follow media, but average Joe just doesn't have time to dig in because there's, it's just people are not necessarily interested. They need to take shortcuts. They need to have like quick information, and sadly, you have still lots of people that are convinced that the North Koreans are fighting alongside the Russians, which by the way, they have a huge army. They don't need North Koreans. And why North Koreans would actually die for Russian war? It doesn't make any sense.
I'm trying to star these questions. That is a good point. That is a good point. And we've talked about this before. You're bringing in North Koreans or any group of people that don't speak your language, Russian, if you're Russia, you're bringing them in. They haven't trained extensively with your forces. They don't speak the same language as your forces. What is the purpose of bringing them in? Unless they're coming in huge numbers. And then if they are, there's no way to hide it. And there's not a single shred of evidence provided that they're even there. So again, this is what the collective West does. This is what the United States does. And this is what the US does regardless of who is president or regardless of who controls Congress. They make things up. They make up these pretexts to then justify actions, just like you said, Angela. They have prepared. They prepared it months, maybe years in advance, this whole strategy to try to blockade, cut Russian maritime shipping and eventually Chinese maritime shipping. We've actually gone over policy papers from years and years ago talking about maritime blockades of China. And the string of pearls was a phrase that was used by U.S. policymakers for a while there about all of these potential areas along China's trade routes, maritime trade routes, that they were building ports to help support their vessels as they were going back and forth, and that they could possibly use them to defend their maritime shipping, which the U.S. doesn't want them to be able to do. They want to be able to cut it when the time comes. They don't want China to be able to fight back. Now, okay, we've laid out a couple of things. One last story. I heard Alexander Mercouris of the Duran talking about this one. Ukraine slows firing of missiles into Russia as Trump prepares to take office. If only someone months or even years ago could predict that using these missiles would make absolutely no difference and would not change any of the fighting on the ground or the strategic direction of this conflict. If only someone could have predicted this. And now the New York Times is finally admitting this. And what I thought was interesting in this article is that they talked about 500 missiles, 500 ATACMS missiles from the US to Ukraine. Now, Alexander Mercouris often says that the ATACMS is no longer in production. I don't know if it is or it isn't, but I found this relatively recent Lockheed Martin fact sheet about the ATACMS, and they said as of fiscal year 2020, they were contracted to make 400 ATACMS. Well, if they sent 500 to Ukraine, they've made absolutely no difference, and the rate of annual production is somewhere around 400, maybe 500. This explains why the U.S. is having such a hard time in this proxy war against Russia. And this explains why the U.S. will have a huge problem if they decide to go to war directly with China. And I wanted to show this, this person who is a bit of a troll. He's claiming that China didn't rise on its own. It's all because the U.S. groomed the Chinese people aren't capable of doing anything on their own, and it's all the U.S. And he said gave it trade preference, gave it missile tech, which I find extraordinarily interesting because the U.S. admits itself that China has a whole vast array of missiles that the U.S. doesn't even have an equivalent of. They don't have any missiles that are capable of doing the things Chinese missiles can do. So did they literally and physically just give them all of their missile technology and no longer have it back in the United States? Is that what happened? I hear this a lot from Westerners who I suspect are deeply racist, and they just simply cannot accept a non-white civilization rivaling or surpassing the West. This is what I think is the problem. So they have to rationalize in their mind why these non-white people are doing incredible things that their modern Western civilization is incapable of. And so they make excuses like, well, they just stole all of our intellectual property. We gave all this technology to them. Otherwise, they would never have been able to figure it out. I think anyone who knows anything about China and its history knows that they were inventing things. They were driving innovation. They had a huge spanning trade network all throughout their history. And this is just a continuation of this, has really very little to do with the West and its contributions. What the West tried to do, and we've talked about this often, is hijack, politically capture China, just like they've politically captured everywhere else. And they failed. They failed. They were unable to do it. And now they're resorting to more drastic measures. Angela, you have anything you want to add to that? I think maybe we should get into the questions and answers since it's
Yeah,
a question and answer section.
I think it's always interesting to see well, how did this happen? You had this transfer of you had some transfer of technologies. You had industrialization of China at the expense of the West. In reality, when you look at history, there was China actually at some point it did side slightly more towards the U.S. against the USSR, but I think it was a very smart move. It was because, it's how they say. Be close to be close to your friends, but even be even closer to your enemies. So China, what it needed back then was to funding. It needed badly funding after World War II was completely destroyed, and it needed transfer of technologies. It needed to be industrialized. So China somehow pretended to be slightly closer to the US, and it was actually antagonizing against the USSR. And this is when you had this trip of Nixon. So, and China pretended it would be actually starting to go towards the the liberalization that the West wanted for China, and to have a co-opted system, controlled by the US, the same as you have in South Korea and Japan. Those are systems that actually have been hijacked by the US. The CIA was funding the political parties both in South Korea and Japan. LDP was funded since the 50s and 60s by the CIA. That's what they wanted to do with China, and this is actually what they've been trying since the 1979, when you had the reforms and opening of China, and they started pouring in lots of money. And this is when you had this first, one of the very first color revolution, 1989, Tiananmen Square. But the idea behind that was really to hijack Chinese democracy and to have it controlled by those globalist corporations, and to turn into a system controlled by lobbies, elites, at the expenses of the Chinese people. And it didn't work out like this, but China had to pretend to be close to the West. And somehow, you see, even Russia and China, when it came to Libya, you see, it was not the time. They could not actually be frontally antagonizing the West. Somehow it had to do concessions. But this is why people need to look at the long-term game. Even when, if people simplify, the same as what happened in Syria, you cannot simplify and say, Russia ditched Syria. No, it's much more complex than that. There's a long-term game, and ultimately it's about national interest. Sometimes you need to compromise. It's not the right time. And for China, all these years, it was not about the right time. Now it has become self-sufficient. Now it has come to a certain level where it can actually face the US and say, well, you cannot be a bully. I'm not going to use the same weapon as you do. China actually, the way it does with the West, it's very important to, and this is actually into the philosophy of the multipolar world. The West, the way it does against its competitors is to put sanctions and pressure. What China does is exactly the opposite. You have an opponent. What you do is that you engage, you have mutual interest, you do trade together, and somehow you have leverage over your opponent. Once you have, let's say, 40% of mutual trade, 40% of your total trade, which is with China, well, you have no interest into confronting China. China has leverage, and ultimately it's about mutually beneficial. So that's how China does. Have you seen China doing sanctions? Why would you do that? They are actually trying to engage. And when you look at the multipolar world, it's about that. You try to trade as much as possible, to engage, and somehow you put aside the differences. And the more you have trade interconnections, the more you actually have no interest into confrontation.
Absolutely. Although I will say, what I've noticed, and this is something that concerns me greatly, and I will get into the questions. You make a very good point. Say all of these nations here in Southeast Asia have a growing and very constructive relationship with China. I've been here since 2003. I have seen with my own eyes the transformation of Thailand and the rest of Southeast Asia from when it was dominated and controlled by the US and Japan to this shift where there's now this huge amount of business and cooperation with China. You can see how everything has gotten better, and the degree of freedom and development that people are enjoying that they never had when the US was the dominant power in this region. The problem is the US, through organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy, infiltrate into these countries. They create political groups, political parties, opposition groups that irrationally pivot away from their best interests, which is continuing to work with China, submitting to the United States, and transforming the country into a battering ram against China. This is exactly what the US did to Ukraine. I remember watching Ukraine and the rest of Europe right before the special military operation as Nord Stream 2 was under construction. I said to myself, there's no way the US is going to succeed. Europe's interests are too deeply invested in peace and stability and cooperating with Russia rather than going to war with Russia. The US will never succeed. And yet the degree of political capture the US had over Europe was such that, yes, actually they can succeed. They can turn the whole region against Russia, destroying Europe in the process, destroying Ukraine even more in the process. And this is the same process they're going to do here and are doing here in Asia. This is what worries me. Because I agree with you, Angela. I think that is the Chinese approach to deepen relations, make these relations mutually beneficial. And the rational decision that a policymaker would make is to continue doing this. You're obviously benefiting from it. But the problem is US soft power, political capture of a nation, is about short-circuiting rational thought, rational policy making. And I don't think that China or Russia have sufficient means to defend against this within their own country, their own political and information space. Yes, helping their partners and potential partners defend their information space so far, no, not at all. This is a huge threat that continues to grow. I just actually, let's just show this real quick. The NED used to disclose all of their country programs. It was listed by country. So now it just says Asia, but before they would have a whole page for Thailand. They would list all the groups, but because people like me and others have been exposing it over the years and people have started to wake up to what this actually means, the threat this constitutes, they've erased all of it. No longer exists. And all you have is this very generic, ambiguous Asia page. And they'll mention like one or two groups here and there from each country, but this is not a disclosure. So the US State Department is funding political sedition in all of these countries covertly, just like they had been doing when it was the CIA handling this. Now the NED, they went from transparency back to covert political sedition. This is the full circle, because people are waking up to it, but it's not happening fast enough. The NED is adapting, and countries need to adapt with it, or they will end up like Libya, Syria, Ukraine. Georgia is still hanging in the balance. Many nations are hanging in the balance. Myanmar is hanging in the balance. So this is a huge problem. I'm optimistic on one hand when I see China's rise and the constructive way it is transforming the region. I can see it with my own eyes. I walk out and experience it. But then when I see governments politically captured by the US and making irrational policy decisions to transform China into an enemy rather than a partner, that should scare people. Maybe we can start going through some of these questions. So this is in order from when I received them. This is about clarity about geopolitical events, identifying the truth at a time when intelligence agencies work to distort the perception of reality in such a way that it subverts. I think there's more to that, but I think we get the general idea, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about how the West deliberately lies, makes up a false pretext to justify policy decisions. You have to start using critical thinking. You should not depend on other people to tell you what to think. You need to learn how to think. And I think if I had a New Year's resolution for 2025, it would be to spend more time, maybe during our live streams or in my videos, showing people how I arrived at these conclusions, how I actually do my analysis. What do you think about that, Angelo?
No, absolutely. I think it's about. We mentioned this last time, but it's about empowering people. Knowledge is power. Once you get the knowledge, actually, but this is not only in terms of geopolitics. It's important at even at the local level how power works. Ultimately, when we touch this, it's about analyzing, at the country level. Is it a sovereign state? I think, and it comes down always to the same thing. What we are advocating here, it's the foundation of democracy. If people, because people throw it all the time, we hear that, especially from the West, but they don't go to the foundation, which is sovereignty. So it's about really like looking at, is it a sovereign state? Am I into a country where we are a sovereign state? And you can take it case by case. You can say, Italy, is it a sovereign state? One by one. And I think this is the foundation. And then once you have that, then you can get to the next level in terms of geopolitics. And then ultimately, it's an extremely macro level. It's about globalist elites, ultimately, that control the whole game because they fund. They do the whole funding. And the ultimate purpose is a deconstruction in terms of society, in terms of individual, because once you deconstruct everything that makes the individual strong, family, religion, all those beliefs that makes actually society to bond together, then you can control them. But ultimately, and then they need to destroy nation states. And that's the project. And this would be controlled by supranational entities. And we see that in Europe. The EU is actually a pilot program for what it could be applied at the world level. So how did it, people don't even actually question themselves. Is it something really organic? Why the Eastern countries wanted to join the EU on the first place? Why? In reality, the EU promised billions and billions of dollars to those countries, and you cannot say no, and they actually buy those politicians. But a country like Georgia, they can say, well, guess what? We're going to give you, if you join the EU, you are going to be net recipients of the EU funding, and it's massive. But ultimately, it's at the expense of Western Europe, average Joe, which actually doesn't benefit from that. On the contrary, he's going to have pressure of wages from cheaper countries, and this provide ultimately to it contributes to mixing up all the population and ultimately to destroy the nation state. That's the project. So I think it's important to look at different levels. And when it comes to geopolitics, it's all about funding. I think the main thing, yes, the only way we can do the homework is funding at all levels. So you can look at the co-opting politicians. What do you do? Where did he study? Did he get a grant? And so on. And who's funding? And so there are many ways to do that. And National Endowment for Democracy was a good example. But as we see, because we started exposing NED, was a very easy game for us. Now it's become back to being extremely opaque, the same as it was with the CIA. Yes. NED was actually doing what the CIA, doing openly what the CIA was doing covertly. Now they're going back to being much more opaque. So now it would be much more difficult. But there's still many entities. I think the Open Society of George Soros, which is de facto an outlet of the CIA, is still doing things in a transparent way, but they're actually very much shifting. And I would take one step ahead. I would say that the trend is no more going through those NGOs. I think those multinational corporations are getting emboldened, and they are funding directly. You even have actually an embassy. Remember, Brian, I think 10, 15 years ago, it would be unthinkable to have embassies to fund political activities. Now you have the embassies that are foreign embassies in Asia that are actually funding directly political movements. And I would say the trend will be more to have like actually BlackRock to be involved directly. I even know that some military industrial complex companies, like Glock, the Glock that they make guns, they actually were involved directly into regime change in Venezuela. So those are actually almost acting as a CIA agent. So those are the trend. Multinational corporation funding more directly and bypassing those intermediaries, which are NGOs. NGOs are just intermediaries, and they actually they funnel the funding, and they embellish because they choose nice names, but ultimately who controls are globalist elites, multinational corporation. And this is going to be the trend that we need to pay attention. So now, when you see movements being funded by Nestle, this is a red flag. It used to be Nestle funding Soros, and then Soros funding that activity. And now it's bypassing, and we need to follow those trends. The work we used to do, Brian, 5 years ago, when we were covering, Maidan, we are covering Hong Kong. It's changing fast. NED, OPEC. Now you have different ways of funding because they need to adapt, and because we've exposed them, right?
Yes. So yes, follow the money. Also, people need to zoom out and see the big picture. Don't get ultra obsessed and focused on one particular conflict. This is a global conflict that is taking place. The US is waging a war against multipolarism. So it is not so many people, and I even see it in the comments from time to time, people are utterly obsessed with Israel, and they believe that Israel somehow controls the United States. And if, again, you follow the money, yes, there is an Israeli lobby and they spend a lot of money, but the arms industry alone spends far more money. And then you have to think there's also big pharma, big ag, big media. There's all of these other giant corporations and I would say cartels of industry that spend money and influence and control Washington and also the think tanks. And Israel ends up, when you actually do your homework and add it all up, it ends up being a proxy just like Ukraine. And if Ukraine hangs in there for another 20, 30 years, or maybe 50 years like Israel has as a proxy of US foreign policy, you'll see them as deeply ingrained in Washington as well. So again, follow the money and zoom out. And Angela, you're absolutely right. They are adapting to being exposed. They are shifting, and we have to shift as well. Now, we covered this one already. Yes, it is a pretext to stop Russian oil from being shipped around. There's no shadow fleet. Again, as the Duran, an excellent resource, people, if you're not following them, please follow them. As they explained, this is about simply not being insured through London. They're insured through some other company. And so this is why the collective West designates it a shadow fleet. It's ridiculous. Here's another one. How fast will Trump attain peace in Ukraine? Trump does not want peace in Ukraine. He wants to continue the war. He just wants Europe to step in and handle it while the US pivots towards China. And this would have happened whether it was Biden, Harris, whoever got in. This is what the US is doing. This is how the US has been pivoting for years and years. All throughout the Biden administration, people were not paying attention to this because they were focused on Ukraine. The Biden administration oversaw the complete overhaul of the U.S. military to specifically confront and fight China in the Asia-Pacific region. The Marine Corps has been entirely reorganized. For decades and decades, they had tank forces. They were told, get rid of your tanks. You're going to do anti-shipping missions, which means interdicting maritime shipping, which is exactly what we were just talking about at the beginning of this video, and is exactly what we're starting to see between the U.S., NATO, and Russia, and its oil tankers. This is what the U.S. is preparing against China. So no, Trump is not trying to obtain peace anywhere. He is continuity of agenda. That's what he represents. He's just a way of convincing the American people that somehow, just even for a moment, there's some sort of hope.
I feel sad, Brian. We have quite a few friends that I have huge respect. Some of my friends, they are pro-sovereignty in France, around the world, and pro-Trump, pro-Vivek, pro Kennedy and so on. And I think the wake up will be extremely brutal. I do understand why they are pro-Trump, and I think some there are indicators that are kind of positive, but this is like very on the surface. But in reality, when you look at who's in his government, there are 13 billionaires. So in reality, I think there's going to be a shift from a government of the 1% to a government by the 0.01%. When you have billionaires in your government, I mean, those people, they have made their money, and this is a way actually to multiply their money. They are going to come back. You see all those politicians that actually went, they went into politics, and this revolving door, they've multiplied by enormously with their wealth. This is
Yes.
what is going to happen. They are going to share more the wealth, and I think this project Doge. Doge, what people do not realize, there are billionaires that are going to work on efficiency. It's not about going to be work about efficiency. The real, actually, if you want to do things for American people, is about going after the corruption and the lobbies. But the lobbies are actually the friends of those billionaires. They are actually behind the lobby. In reality, I think there's a huge project which is very similar to Millet. So they call it quote unquote liberalization. It's a nice word, but in reality, it's about selling. Everything's already privatized mostly in the US, but there are lots of actually things that are going to be even more aggressively sold. The jewels of the US, still state-owned assets, and it is going to be about deregulation. Of course, they present regulation as being something that is against business, but in reality, it's going to be ultra liberal, and I'm very skeptical. I think the wake up will be very painful, and I do understand. Biden was so. I mean, we hit the bottom. So people, you would have given an alternative, even vote for a goat or a cat. People would have voted for a goat or a cat. I do understand. And the speeches are nice and so on. But ultimately, they do not represent the 99%. Why would they? If you are the 99%, you want to have a better share of the wealth. You've seen the wealth gap has been increasing. It's just, if you look at the data, it's been dramatic. In reality, everything is going to the 1%. Now you're putting the 1% in charge, and you think the 99% are going to being an advantage. No, they are going to rip you off even more. Homelessness, poor people. I mean, what did Trump do when he was elected? The first thing he did was actually to lower the tax bracket of the rich. That's what he did. And it's going to get even worse. We put billionaires in charge. And why would you, average Joe, why would you be proud of having billionaires in charge? Even Elon Musk. And, Elon Musk has done great things for Twitter. Yeah, okay. He's, but ultimately he's a billionaire. We need already to start being extremely careful, because they become too powerful, and I think Biden was the problem yesterday, and this new administration might be as bad over time. It's not going to work
average
Joe in the US. I tell you, I'm not going to work for you. They're working for themselves, and the class struggle, it's going to be massive. People are going to get hurt badly.
No, you're absolutely right. It's, as I say, it's continuity of agenda. People get overly focused on people like personalities like Biden or Trump or Harris. These people are just sitting in a chair. They don't actually hold any real power. Their cabinets are, if you really dig deep into the cabinets, they're exactly the same people. They're all warmongers, drawn from the think tanks, drawn from the corporate financier special interests that actually run the United States. Now, Angelo, your point right there as the perfect segue to this question. It says, I love your work, but how can you stand behind Tesla and SpaceX? In any normal country, Musk would be in jail for insider trading. Trump has hired the PayPal mafia, who is the deep state. Now, yeah, I don't agree with all. Like Angela said, these are all billionaires. They don't belong in politics at all. They're supposed to work for the state, not run the state. Now, you have to be objective. Elon Musk at SpaceX and at Tesla has done amazing things in terms of manufacturing, engineering, space flight. Objectively, he has done amazing things that nobody else anywhere else on Earth has done. Now, with the electric cars, China has caught up and surpassed Tesla. In terms of space flight, SpaceX is at the top of the game. You cannot take that away from him. He did that. He and the company he built did that. And he is, if you followed him from the very beginning, you know that he is actually passionate about that. I think it is a huge mistake for him to get involved in politics. He obviously doesn't understand politics, clearly. He always talks about first principles in terms of engineering. But when it comes to politics, he's very ideological, and he has no interest or desire to apply first principles to politics. If he did, he would have completely different talking points, a completely different stance than he does right now. So it's very important. Give credit where credit's due. But just because I admire what has been done by SpaceX and Tesla does not mean that I agree with everything Elon Musk does. I just said it. He doesn't belong in politics. I don't agree with pretty much anything he has said regarding politics. Angela said, yes, he bought Twitter. He transformed it into X. I was permanently banned on Twitter. You would not see me on X if it wasn't for it going from Twitter to X. However, he has already used X to help advance U.S. foreign policy. I remember for like a day or two, like for 24 hours, I don't know if he was just sitting there in front of the computer all day or what, but he was cheering for CIA-backed regime change in Venezuela. And he has now done this on several occasions. And think about it. I always talk about information space, nations needing to secure their information space because Facebook, X, before that Twitter, are connected to the State Department. Now you have Musk, who's literally in the US government, and he controls this global social media platform. So countries need to wake up. They need to start creating their own social media platforms, and the multipolar world needs multipolar social media platforms that are not controlled by the US, by Silicon Valley, by the State Department, by Wall Street. So I hope that clears up where I stand on Elon Musk. I don't agree with anything he's doing. I don't support or have any hope at all in the Trump administration. I've done entire videos over and over again, all during his first term. I warned people before he even stepped foot in office the first term that he was lining up a bunch of neocons. It was going to be continued. Everything continued. He ended up trying his hardest to start additional wars, and he didn't stop any of the wars he promised to stop. So just keep all of that in mind.
I think also, what I mean, we need to be extremely careful. I'm talking about here really the future. I look at the future. Elon Musk is by far the richest man on earth. Addition to that, he has become the most influential. Now he has Twitter is becoming, X is becoming also the most influential platform. And in addition to that, he's because he is I would say he almost was a centerpiece in making Trump the next president. So he has a huge leverage on the president, and he's part of the military-industrial complex. So I have the impression that it's been probably now he's probably at the level in terms of influence of the Rockefeller. The Rockefeller in the old days is extremely powerful, and we need to really pay attention. And what worries me, as you said, is actually when somebody like respected, because he's respected, like Elon Musk, calls for regime change in Venezuela. I think he's overstepping, and this would never happen if let's say if it was in China. You never have a businessman to even try to touch into politics, and those should be completely separated. In reality, who is running the show in the US are those businessmen. Just follow the money. Who's behind Trump? As we say, the comment was the PayPal mafia, Peter Thiel. You have also the Israeli lobby and so on. So I would say just be extremely careful. And I think the problem is that a lot of people are attracted by personalities. When you look at Trump, Vivek, Kennedy, and Elon Musk, in terms of personality, between you and I, if I had the choice to spend an evening with either them or Biden, Kamala, Hunter Biden, I think there's no question. I would rather be with Elon Musk, Trump, and Vivek and Kennedy. Oh yeah, but this is the problem. I think a lot of people are driven by those personalities, and also because of the Democrats have been too far into identity politics. That people got extremely tired, and they're driven by subjective things, just personalities, and they're more pleasant. To be honest, I find even Colby, I don't agree with most of what he says, but in terms of he's not as when I look at the team of Biden, he's a bit better in terms of he has a bit more brain. To be honest,
I would have to disagree with that. I think he looks like he came sprouted out of the same cloud of spores as Jake Sullivan.
Yeah, but I would say, but the problem is that because the Biden administration has set the level so low that anything, even Colby, seems in somehow more reason. You know what he says, Colby? He says when Trump is going to meet with Xi Jinping, well, maybe it's just word, but he said he should respect Xi Jinping, not like the last administration did, was just to be extremely arrogant and so on. I mean, those are a bit of sensitive things here and there, but ultimately it's the same policy. I agree with you, absolutely.
Yes. Absolutely. We kind of went over this. How is the U.S. currently meddling in Thailand's internal affairs? It's like a disease. The NED spends millions and millions of dollars every year in every country, including here in Thailand, just building out their capabilities, their capacity. They build up new media platforms every year. They draw in hundreds, if not thousands, of people on scholarships, exchange programs, internships. And they're just cultivating a parallel system side by side with the indigenous system that Thai people have created and have had for centuries, and which has kept them a sovereign country for centuries. It was the only Southeast Asian country never colonized by Western powers. And it's not some brilliant master stroke of strategy. It's just like a disease. It just keeps spreading. And if you don't address it, one day you're going to wake up and you're not going to be able to get out of bed, or you will have died in your sleep. That is what happens to these countries. That's what happened to Libya and Syria. They left it unchecked. They didn't uproot it completely and absolutely. They allowed the United States to pressure them into allowing it to continue. They always say, if you uproot NED funding in your country, we're going to put sanctions. We're going to make your life miserable. We're going to really make you uncomfortable. And they cave to that. Instead of just uprooting it and facing the discomfort for a short period of time, they allow it to fester. But if you allow it to fester, eventually you're going to wake up and you will have no country at all. This is exactly what happened to Bangladesh, the administration there. They knew about it. They complained about it. But ultimately, they did nothing about it. And one day, she woke up and she was on a helicopter flying out of Bangladesh, and she was never going to come back, or at least not anytime soon. Angelo?
Yeah, I'd like to add one thing. I think one of the reasons also that some countries allow NED, and actually it is related to the pressure that is actually going through the IMF and the World Bank. So basically, those loans are conditional to reforms, and conditional to have those countries to accept all those NGOs, and including those CIA agency like NED, and also those countries need to join the ICC, ICJ, International Court. Otherwise, they cannot actually have those loans. So you see, by doing that, they give the loans, and those are the debt trap. Not only those loans are they make it very difficult to be repaid. But in addition to that, they hijack completely the democracy, because you actually invite the wolf in your house by having all those NGOs and you legal system, because very often the ICC, once you join the ICC, you need to go along. You are in a position that you cannot accept, for example, like Brazil. Brazil could not actually, was sensitive to have Putin to go to Brazil. So you see, this is actually why you have the role of the World Bank and the IMF, as a debt trap, and that's how they can. They make it difficult not to accept those NED.
Yes, that is a good point. There's a lot of points of leverage they can use to force a country. Well, this is what I'm saying for BRICS, for the multipolar world. There needs to be cooperation to really give alternatives and to give safety and security from these threats that force these countries to tolerate the NED, which again is just a ticking time bomb. As the longer you leave it, the worse it will be. Let's see. Here's another one about the Trump administration. Will he continue the Ukraine war and pressure on Russia by having Europe pay more toward? This is what he has literally come out and said after the election. And this is what he did last time, too. This is exactly what he did last time, his first administration. He was arming, he was the first US president to preside over the arming of Ukrainian forces, which were already being trained by NATO from 2014 onward. So no, he is not the solution. He's not opposed to any of this. He's a politician who tells you what you want to hear to get your support, and then he continues doing whatever he feels like doing once he gets into office. He did it the first time. He's openly, blatantly doing it this time. And as Angela has pointed out, people believe that Biden was so bad, they feel like this is a relief, when in reality it is just continuity of agenda. This is the brilliance of Western-style democracy. It is not a form of self-determination. It is a system of control, and this is how they do it. These false choices, false dichotomies, this strategy of tension and manipulation. They're pulling people's strings. They're playing them like a fiddle.
We got fooled by Obama, right? Remember, he was going to change everything. How many they fell into the trap? Actually, they had prepared Obama very early on. You see, Obama had taken a stance against the Iraqi war, but that's because they were already preparing. They had pre-selected him early on, and in reality, he came as a warmonger. They even gave him without having any track record. They gave him a Nobel Peace Prize. It was
That's your first clue. Yeah.
And very often, you realize that even now, one of the elements, the signals that tells you that those are going to be the next president is, I would say, one is they joined the Bilderberg Group a few years earlier, like Clinton did and like many did before, and they have a Netflix documentary on them. That's another one. Automatically you see a Netflix, and by the way, you have since you are in Thailand, you have the Move Forward Party. I forgot his name.
Thanathorn Juangroongruangkit. It's a tough one to remember.
He's got his Netflix documentary, and that's how it works. They're shaping the perception, and so it's a vicious circle of elect and regret. And sadly, this is another probably Obama moment. And believe me, I do not like that to say that. I do understand that people need to have hope, because otherwise it's hard to wake up in the morning and saying, well, we had this new election and nothing's going to change. But I'm just going to kill the whole spirit of change. No, it's nothing. Not much will change. It's I think until there's something like a collapse, or something that's I don't know what could change. I think every country people need to re-empower themselves. The power should go to the 100%, and they need to have a mature democracy, not the mob rule of people dividing, but to be together ultimately. And that's what China does. Actually, China has, it's not only the CPC, you have other parties that join in, and they can consult together. The CPC is actually taking feedbacks from those parties, but ultimately it needs to work for the 100%. So I would say that like in the case of the US, in every single country, they need to find a system that ultimately works for the people and not this divide and conquer. This divide and control thing is used everywhere. It's used internally and it's used to wage wars around the world. You see, I mean, if you pay attention at Ukraine, in Ukraine, it's Russians fighting Russians because Ukrainians are Russians. Most are Russians. In the Middle East, have you seen that? In Syria, Arabs fighting Arabs, Muslim fighting Muslim. But it's been like this in the Middle East. This sectarian, I mean, stupid. It's very stupid. The US is funding one side and they're killing each other, and Muslims are killing Muslim. Now, what is happening in Asia is going to be Asians fighting Asians, and in the case of Taiwan, Chinese fighting Chinese. If people could just realize that, well, there's always somebody pulling the strings. They decide with one side and they say, I've got you back, fight the other guy. And it's all the time the same. This is those hybrid warfare, those proxy war, and people fall into the trap over and over, sadly.
Yes, absolutely right. And again, this comes back to information space. You either have to have something that is unifying the people in your country to such a degree that no amount of outside influence can divide people, which nowadays is impossible to do, or you need to secure your information space like Russia and China have done. And if you don't do that, then your country is going to be divided and destroyed. It's just a matter of time. I see it happening here. I've watched it happen successfully in Myanmar, the Philippines. They've been divided and conquered since they were a colony of the a literal colony of the United States following the Spanish-American War. This is a very good point. This is actually out of order, but it dovetails into the next question I was going to put up there. Fake reformists are dismantling Iran. I've heard a lot of people saying this. I've seen a lot of troubling news and comments, and it's hard to tell what Iran is doing for diplomatic and public perception purposes and what they're actually doing as a matter of policy. Now, they had been doing a relatively good job considering what has been done to them for decades in terms of asymmetrical military power across the region. They still have significant asymmetrical military power across the region. They have significant deterrence in the form of their ballistic missile program. It's an internal matter for them to sort out. They have the military, they have special interests in Iran. They need to sort that out. I don't know what the reformists are doing, where their source of power and support come from. That's something that Iran needs to sort out. And either they can or they cannot. And we just watched what happened to Syria. And if Iran was stronger than it is now, that wouldn't have happened, but it did happen. So this tells us that there are limits to the power of countries like Iran or even Russia and China. There are limits to what they can do, and we have to keep a close eye on that. The next question, go ahead, Angela, and then I'll read this next question.
I just want to add, it's really important because the question was related to reformists. We are not ideology. There's no ideology in what we are doing. We talk always about sovereignty. So basically self-determination. So let's say if the Taliban decides to, it gets the majority and the support of their people in Afghanistan, I have no word to say, really. I look at only Afghani can decide for their own fate. So even if there's a dictatorship in Syria, well, it's up to Syrians to solve that. But I'm not going to judge how a president is ruling his country or is running his country. If there's no foreign meddling ultimately. But in reality, what is the worst for a country is, and I think this is what a lot of people do, they make the mistake, is that they're willing to accept a fake democracy which is run from Washington rather than a brutal dictatorship which is run by their own president. What I'm saying is that right now, Syria, take the example of Syria, they put in place someone who has been funded by the US, support from Israel, and Turkey. He was born in Saudi Arabia. I even doubt that he's even Syrian, because I don't, if you analyze Jolani, there's not even a picture with him and his father. We cannot actually trace back exactly what is his background. It's impossible, right? So there's a Saudi now running the country, and so it's not a sovereign state. It's completely, Syria has lost its sovereignty. And I would say I do not judge any government, and I think the same for you, Brian. It's all about sovereignty, self-determination. If people really talk about democracy, that's the first precondition. The rest, it's not a business, really. Who am I? And it's the same as, let's say, China. I might like a lot of things that China is doing for the CPC that is doing for its people, and I see the satisfaction level. People are happy, but it's not up to me to judge who should be running China. But at least I can say that at least when it comes to China and Russia, they are sovereign state, and I would say you're a sovereign state. You have dignity. I mean, really, you have dignity because you are not, a servant. You're not carrying the water for Western state, and you can look at yourself in the face and say, I protect my own family. It's the same. Why would you have your neighbors coming to your house and telling you how you have to raise your kids? You don't accept this as a family man, Brian. Why would you do that if you were a country? That's unacceptable. If you're a father and you have other people deciding for your education at home, you don't have dignity. It's the same when it comes to a country.
Yes.
That's the point. It was just to answer to ideology. We don't care, ultimately.
Yeah. Well, the problem with Iran is that it is obviously the target of U.S. interference, subversion, sedition, has been for decades. And it's possible that there are political groups that are being backed by the West that are working their way into power. But that's up to the security apparatus in Iran to deal with it. If they cannot deal with it, then there's really no hope for Iran. Because like I said, it is a disease that, if left unchecked, will eventually consume a nation's sovereignty, which is what you're referring to, Angela. Now, this question is important. Why does Iran support Hamas? Well, they don't support Hamas. They support certain people and factions within Hamas. And the whole point is precisely because it is from the Muslim Brotherhood and it is a creation and proxy of the West. They want to pivot it away from that toward a legitimate resistance organization. And then maybe the huge disaster that we've seen unfold from Gaza to southern Lebanon to now Syria, this might not have happened had Hamas been a legitimate resistance organization rather than a proxy and a provocateur. That's what it is. That's what it has always been. I saw there's another related question. I'm not sure if I can find it here right away, but the question was, why is Hamas supporting the government in Syria right now? Because they are Western proxies. They are from the exact same cloud of extremists that have been built up and spread out across the region since the British Empire was running it, and the US took over and have continued advancing all of this. So that's the reason why. Angela, you want to add something? Go ahead.
Yeah,
yes.
we were heavily criticized. I mean, right after October 7, we actually pointed out that the background of Hamas was a Muslim Brotherhood, that Netanyahu actually supported Hamas because he needed the Hamas. And then because of this whole intelligence failure, in reality, it was convenient for Israel to have this October 7. And we see October 7, what it triggered. So in reality, the Hamas was a tool. But we support the Palestinian cause, this cause of self-determination. Again, it's not ideology driven. But when you look at the funding, Hamas and Qatar doesn't have, I do not believe that those countries, those monarchies, that are controlled by the US, has any at heart the cause of Palestinians. Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia have been working with Israel for a long time. Yeah. But we were hammered by people, because I do understand, by people pro-Palestinians, because I do understand when you see those Hamas fighting against IDF, people take the easy equation, but in reality, Hamas was part of the problem. And when you look at where is Palestine, again, but it's very complex. Ultimately, I do understand also people that are criticizing Abbas, and the corruption and so on. It's extremely complicated issue. But we look at the funding. Was it an organic movement from Palestinians? No, it was the Muslim Brotherhood, and historically the Muslim Brotherhood is MI6, and it tells you everything there.
Yes, and so this question, why do Muslim fundamentalists, I don't really like even calling them Muslims, because they're not real Muslims. They're extremists who have adopted or have been indoctrinated into a political perversion of Islam. The Muslim Brotherhood, for example, why do they allow themselves to be played by Western powers? This is a good question. The answer is they're not allowing themselves to be played by the West. They were created by the West. The West works with Saudi Arabia to deliberately target ignorant, vulnerable people, radicalize them, and recruit them. This is what they do. They have a whole pipeline for doing it. They also had a whole pipeline from Xinjiang in Western China, pulling out these extremists that were radicalized by the US, by Turkey, by Saudi Arabia for years and years, and then bringing them through Southeast Asia to Turkey, into Syria to fight alongside Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So this is a terrorist industrial complex, I guess you can call it, and it is created by the U.S., has nothing to do with Islam, is hiding behind a smokescreen of what they claim is Islam or fundamentalist Islam, but it isn't. It's just the U.S. doing what it does everywhere. They have groups of people who are extremists like this here in Asia that have nothing to do with any kind of religion. They find any sort of social fault line, they exploit it. They radicalize people on both sides, and they use them against each other and against others in the region. This is what all empire has always done. It's a very old trick, and yet people still really aren't getting it, because they become so emotional, and their emotions blind them to reason and logic and history. And it's a shame, because it creates this endless cycle that cannot be broken. Let's see.
Just to add one thing about when it comes to Muslim, I think, to be honest, we should just, I would just call them Muslim, but I would not put any connotation. Muslims are Muslim. Why would you be sectarian? This is actually the way it's been manipulated and played by the West. They've created Muslims, this sectarian divide, the Shia, the Sunni, and you have multiple. Then you have other subdivides, but this was a tool just to divide the whole Muslim world, the whole Arab world. And I think this is why I find it extremely stupid. Really, you had how it is working for your cause. Really, it's been dividing forever, and the Arab world has been played. When you look at the Arab world, it's been played since the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The Arabs actually, they believed the British Empire. They sided on the side of the British Empire against the Ottoman Empire, because the British Empire promised them to have self-determination. And then you had this agreement of the Sykes-Picot. You had the French and the British carving up all those states, which were actually not natural states, because they planted the seeds to divide them. So this is why you had the Kurdistan being split. You had actually Kuwait being taken away from Iraq, and then they started dividing over Shia, Sunni, and so on. And they're still being played. When you look at the Palestinian conflict, they managed to have Palestinians taking side against Assad. Now Assad is gone. Those pro-Palestinians, they sided against those forces that are actually funded by ISIS, and ultimately as Israel is expanding. So I would just do like this. Bravo. What did it do to your cause to side against Assad? Not that I'm a fan of Assad, but ultimately it was obvious Assad was like him or not, but somehow he was preserving the sovereignty, at least the physical sovereignty of Syria. Now it's gone. Now it's gone. Now you have Saudi running the country, and you have Israel expanding for its project of greater Israel. So you are what Lenin used to call a useful idiot. Sorry for this ranting.
No, it's okay. I mean, it's an issue that, like I said, it makes it makes me emotional. But I try to separate that from when I'm trying to make decisions and do analysis. But it's because people get so emotional. This is what's so frustrating about it. You want people to see through this, and they cannot. And Israel does things on purpose, deliberately. They're deliberately brutal on the Palestinians, deliberately killing innocent people to blind you with anger so that you cannot see through what's going on, so that you can never arrive at any real solution, so that you play a role in keeping this cycle going round and round and round. Now, here is, we'll go back to China now. The woeful state of the American military, how are they planning on fighting China? I think we did kind of answer this. It's not that they're planning to fight China directly. They are preparing the stage to try to strangle China economically, including using military force, including targeting maritime shipping. So like I said, this whole situation that played out in the Black Sea, this situation now unfolding with ships carrying Russian hydrocarbons, this is going to be very important to watch. It's going to be very important for China to watch and learn from, because it's going to be their maritime shipping that is targeted next. They know that their Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure is already being targeted on land. It's just a matter of time before their ships are targeted at sea. The U.S., people like Elbridge Colby are again, fundamentally racist. They cannot accept a non-white nation surpassing the collective West. I'm sorry if that offends people. I don't care. It's the truth. This is how they feel. I know these people. I was surrounded by them when I was in the military. This is how they think about the world. They will not tolerate it. It is the worst nightmare, because they are so convinced of their superiority to watch someone else surpassing them. This is like their mind is being blown, but they have access to nuclear weapons and a global spanning military force. So this is what makes it so dangerous. Let's try to get to the next one. Angela, you got anything you want to add to that? So the U.S. military, I don't think they're going to fight China directly.
No,
but it is by proxy.
When was the last time that actually the U.S. fought a peer? I don't know. We have to go back to Korea, I would say, but the U.S. doesn't fight the wars. Even World War II, if you really look at what happened, they were funding both sides. They propped up, they helped Hitler to get into power. Once Hitler was actually almost about to win the war, they started shifting, a huge production of tanks for the USSR, and funding the USSR on the Lend-Lease agreement, which, by the way, USSR and through Russia, they ended paying back, but ultimately they didn't fight World War II. They came when the war was over, and they even used 2 nuclear bombs that to Japan. That actually most Japanese, some Japanese, they even think that the USSR did that to them. That's how brainwashed they are. But in reality, that's what they do. They rather fund a country, push a country towards war, and they provide support, and ultimately they don't necessarily, in their strategy, they don't necessarily need to win. If they contain and destroy, and that's good enough. In the case of Syria and Libya, well, they become failed state, and it's mission accomplished for them. If they cannot necessarily U.S. puppet regime they can completely control and actually strip out all the resources, they'd rather destroy it, and it's fine with them. That's fine with them, because it's not about making the pie bigger. The pie can get smaller, it is okay, but they want the biggest share of the pie. While when it comes to China, the idea is how we can make the pie bigger And so, in terms of absolute term, everybody gets more. No, well, the US is about the winner take all. And even when it comes to its relationship with Europe, it's only about transfer of wealth. Since World War II, it's been completed. Europe has been actually transferring wealth. At least the last 15 years. If you look at the GDP of Europe and the US, it's all a transfer of wealth. And we see now with the LNG gas, weapons, even weapons production, they impose upon European countries not to have European weapons to be purchased for NATO. Those 2-3% they need to reach. It's actually purchased in the US, where Eastern countries, Poland and so on, they all don't buy European weapons, but they buy US weapons. So even their friends, they squeeze them. And they did that with Japan too in 1987. Japan was getting too big of an economy. They imposed upon Japan the Plaza Accord. And Japan hasn't recovered since 1987.
Yes. The US doesn't have any friends. They just have a network of client states and prospective client states. That's all it is. And nations that refuse to become client states. That is the only type of relationship you have with the United States. Now, I see this every time an ammunition depot is struck anywhere. I hear people asking me, did someone just use a nuclear weapon? When an ammunition depot is struck, it creates a huge explosion and what appears to be a mushroom cloud, but it is not a nuclear explosion. If there was, you can bet that nation states would be talking about this. You cannot just nuke someone and have the entire planet be quiet. That is inconceivable. And that's what arms depots do. So please just look at footage of other arms depots being struck. That's what it looks like. It looks like a huge explosion because there's an army's worth of arms and ammunition inside a very small area. And when it explodes with tremendous force, bigger than any type of ordnance you would normally see used in modern warfare. So let's just keep that in mind the next time we see that happen. Let's see here. This guy again. Did you know that Taiwan was not part of the ancient Chinese dynasties? In fact, the Dutch had it before the Chinese. Taiwan is not China. It's their choice. No, it is literally China. Everyone on Taiwan is Chinese. They speak Chinese. They look in the mirror and they see Chinese people staring back at them. They are Chinese. A lot of them know they're Chinese. And the only reason anyone there thinks that they are not Chinese is because the NED has been funding propaganda to brainwash them, just like they've been brainwashing Ukrainians who are 100% Slavs, making them think that there's some lost Aryan tribe. They got lost in Ukraine somewhere, and they're the lost tribe of the master race. It's NED, CIA propaganda. Their best interests are to peacefully reunite with the rest of China. That is where their best interests lie. If they do not, they're going to either be economically isolated and their economy will be obliterated, or it'll trigger some kind of war and Taiwan, the island, will be obliterated. So there really is no interest to pursue this U.S. policy of separating Taiwan from the rest of China. Angelo, what do you think about that?
Well, again, it's just manipulation of history. You had, if you really look at who was occupying the first inhabitant of Taiwan, were Aborigines, and those ones that they actually they were slaughtered by both actually Japanese and even the Kuomintang that came over the island. But the mirror doesn't lie. They're all Chinese. They speak Chinese. They write Chinese. They eat Chinese food. You had, I think, two waves. You had the Chinese that had been there for thousands of years, and then you had a big wave of the Kuomintang that moved from the mainland in 1949 when they were losing the war against the communists. They moved to Taiwan, and then Japan had to leave Taiwan at some point. It was the San Francisco agreement that actually Kuomintang could take over. Kuomintang, which was controlled by the U.S. and actually China was supposed to take back mainland was supposed to take back Taiwan, but they were engulfed into the Korean War, so they had no more resources. China was completely destroyed, and the US needed Taiwan just to contain China, because when you look at the whole geography, China is surrounded by U.S. Army bases, and Taiwan it creates a whole wall that submarines de facto actually would be difficult. They could be easily detected when it comes to China. So Taiwan is what they, for the U.S., is what they call unthinkable, what you call unthinkable
Aircraft carrier. Yes.
Aircraft carrier. Yeah.
Yes. That's what General Douglas MacArthur was calling it. If you read old U.S. State Department and Department of Defense papers back from that time, they were talking about how we need to control Taiwan, because if we control Taiwan, we control the rest of China. And so they've been playing this game all along. And again, they know that they've done a good job conditioning the American people to fear the rise of China, because they don't look like us, they don't sound like us. And so them surpassing us and having tremendous wealth and power, that's scary. That's unacceptable. It was acceptable for the US to have it for decades and decades and abuse it horrendously. But for a country that hasn't been to war in the 21st century, that's scarier. So they've been doing this for a long time. And again, all you have to do is read the papers, read the documents. They're all out there, and they explain it in great detail. It's not even really a secret. The thing is, a lot of people already hate China, and so they're not really trying to find out the truth. They're just trying to justify their hatred for China. That's what a lot of this is. When I have people confused about it, or who don't like China, and they're wondering why I'm a CCP shill or something, it's because they hate China to start with, because of bias, inherent bias, and they're just trying to justify it. But all we can do is just continue trying. Here's another one about Myanmar. So yes, the U.S. created a proxy war in Myanmar. This has been going on since the end of World War II. The British had colonized Myanmar. It was called Burma. And the British, just like we said, they divided everyone against each other, and they ruled over Burma. These were all different ethnic groups, different religions. They pitted them against each other. They took the ethnic minorities, put them in positions of power within the British administration over the ethnic majority, which inherently created tension. And it continues to this day. You cannot talk to these people engaged in this fight on either side. You cannot reason with them, because they are so blinded by these age-old British-created divisions in their society. It is terrible, and the country is dysfunctional because of it. If there is a chance for peace, it's ASEAN doing something about U.S. meddling in Southeast Asia. Most of what's happening in Myanmar, the U.S. is doing based in Thailand. If Thailand passed an NGO law and closed all these NGOs down, that would knock the wind out of U.S. meddling in next door Myanmar. And if ASEAN and China work together to secure information and political space in the region, why does the U.S. have so much influence on the other side of the planet politically? Influence that if any other country exercised inside the U.S. would be called interference, political interference, election interference, election meddling, would not be tolerated for a moment. Why should the U.S. be tolerated doing that? So Myanmar is something to keep an eye on all throughout next year. It has the potential to become the next Libya or Syria, to be honest. Let's see what else. Going on to 2 hours. I think we'll cut it at 2 hours. I want to thank you, Angela, for hanging in there. We said it was going to be question and answers. We went for half an hour without answering any questions. Let's see if there's any other.
Yeah, I want to add, I think for people, maybe if they haven't followed the episode we did on Myanmar, that basically Aung San Suu Kyi was the U.S. puppet, was the Zelensky for Myanmar. And so basically she was funded by the U.S. She was actually surrounded by Western, how can I say, governors that were controlling her. And once she was elected, she started actually, there was this task force that we analyzed. It was by Asia Foundation, was George Soros himself was actually in the meeting. And they were basically trying to, they already had a plan to completely hijack the democracy, but also to sell all state-owned assets. I mean, to strip completely all the wealth from Myanmar and to completely hijack Myanmar. And this is why military took over. And in reality, it's very counterintuitive. You might think, oh, are you supporting the military? But ultimately, in many countries, the militaries are a tool just to preserve the sovereignty. And that's what they have. That's what they try. They managed to do in by the way, in Thailand. The military they have a veto power on the constitution. Because I think they have to. You correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, but they have 25% of the votes at the parliament, right? And do you need 75% of votes to enact a new constitution? So at least the constitutional level, which is the highest level, they can still preserve some type of buffer, and that's what the Myanmar military did. And this is the root of the civil war in Burma. Now you have all those US-backed, supposedly quote unquote democracy activists that are actually they turn into ISIS. People don't know it, but I've shared with you, Brian. I mean, they're chopping heads in Myanmar. Those people are bombing school. They're killing village leaders.
And they brag about it in the U.S. government-funded opposition media. They say, yes, we're bombing schools, and then they try to justify why they're doing it. You have to see it to believe it. We've been covering this for years. Please continue. Didn't mean to interrupt you, Angelo.
No. It's people need to know, but it's very counterintuitive. People hear a military junta or coup. People need to understand that there are coups happening. Some are legitimate. Actually, military taking over is, it's the last buffer very often for those countries in the region, is that because they need to regain sovereignty. Who likes military rule government? I mean, nobody. But in reality, if you don't have sovereignty, you'd rather have the military running things until you find a system which is more inclusive, more mature, and compromising with the 100%, not dividing, because it's easy to divide a country like Myanmar. It's the most diverse country in the region. There are over 50 nationalities. It's extremely complex, and they have planted some seeds. When Myanmar became independent, the Western powers, they planted seeds for destabilize those places. So it is important to understand what is the root of the current civil war. But by the way, Myanmar has been under off and on tensions wars for forever. But the latest one is related to this puppet regime under Aung San Suu Kyi, which she was working against our country. I don't even know if she spoke fluently Burmese, Myanmar language. She was kind of the same as Zurashvili, the French president of Georgia, which is supposed to step back. She was supposed to step back yesterday, right?
Yeah, but I think so.
She doesn't even speak well Georgian. She used to work for NATO. She's a student of Brzezinski. She was a student of Brzezinski, and she got the nationality, Georgian nationality, only I think 10 or 15 years ago. She doesn't even speak well Georgian. So Aung San Suu Kyi, she's that type of person.
Yes. She spoke with a perfect British accent. I could tell you that. So yes, when this is what you're talking about, Angelo, are people that superficially see a military coup and they say that's bad. They overthrew an elected government. The problem is the government in Myanmar wasn't really elected. The whole election, the whole political process was imposed on Myanmar. Western-style democracy was imposed on Myanmar, and every aspect of it infiltrated and manipulated by the NED. I've showed the list endless list of programs the U.S. government is funding, touching all of the most central aspects of a nation's sovereignty: the Constitution, the courts, elections, election monitoring, building political parties. The U.S. is spending money building political parties. What if China was building a political party in the United States? How long would that be allowed to go on? And who would sit there and try to defend it? Nobody. Nobody would try. No one supporting China would even try to defend that. They would say, why are you doing what the U.S. is doing? Don't become like the United States. So again, you have to look past the superficiality presented by the Western media and look at the actual facts. This isn't a question, but this is an important point. The West will use the Uyghurs against China. They already have been, and not the entirety of the Uyghur population in China. A small minority, radicalized deliberately and used as terrorists, as proxies, as separatists against the rest of China. And I remember, and I often read this BBC article from, I think it was 2014, where the BBC was proudly listing all of the horrible terrorism, because at that point, China couldn't contain it. Now, when they talk about Uyghurs, they talk about some Chinese crackdown. They never mention any of this violence. And they're playing a very cynical game where they created the violence. China reacted to it. They refuse to acknowledge the violence, and they only show China reacting to it. And they do this everywhere, to every country, every government they've targeted for regime change. They create provocations. When they react, they point and say, look at these brutal dictators. Look at President Assad putting all these people in prison. No one talks about the fact that these people being put in prison were basically Al-Qaeda in Syria. So this is what the U.S. does. And yes, don't forget about the Uyghur separatists. The U.S. is still sponsoring, arming, training. They're in Syria, and they've pledged to go back to China. I don't think they're going back to China, but I think they will be expanding the U.S. proxy war on China's Belt and Road Initiative. You have anything you want to add to that one, Angelo?
Well, I just want to add, I don't know if you remember, we covered this video by Erin Alptekin, who's the founder of the World Uyghur Congress. And he used to work for Radio Free Asia. He was instrumental in the partition of the USSR when he was actually calling through Radio Free Asia, or Voice of America, sorry, to a partition of those Turkish countries. So he's the founder of the World Uyghur Congress. And basically at this, he did a speech once. He was saying, well, the Americans, well, why don't you come and help us liberate us, and we are going to share the wealth of Xinjiang, which, by the way, Xinjiang is, they have massive oil and gas resources. And it reminds me of exactly what Zelensky did with the US and BlackRock. He said, well, come, give us weapons and so on, and we are going to share the whole wealth of Ukraine. And when you look at Ukraine right now, not only it's destroyed, but all the land, all the wealth has been sold to BlackRock and all those hedge fund companies. So that model, CIA agents, Voice of America is by de facto he was a CIA agent. So there's nothing organic. It was not working for Xinjiang or even its people. It was just organic, heavily funded by the West just to destroy China. And ultimately, it was actually a terrorist organization that turned into ETIM. And I think 10 or 20,000 of those terrorists were fighting in Syria. And those ones fighting in Syria were supposed to go back to China and do more damage, try to do damage. But this doesn't work with China because of national security law and because of China has been working hard on preserving its sovereignty. That's what all the countries should do around the world, is learning from at least China and in a minor way Russia. Russia still has to clean up this whole foreign meddling, but China, it would be impossible now to have any regime change, non-organic regime change coming from the West.
Yeah, so in addition to the collapse of Syria leading to now U.S. focus on Iran next, and the U.S. pivoting from Ukraine to China and having Europe try to step in and keep the war going in Ukraine. Keep an eye on Myanmar, keep an eye on these Uyghur extremists. These Uyghur, they're terrorists. At this point, they're running around with guns, killing people. They're undoubtedly terrorists. Keep an eye on them. I think they are going to be then used across Eurasia to target Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure. This is a good question. What can China do against West's propaganda machine? And Angela just got done saying that inside China, they control Chinese information and political space. Every nation should control it, just like they control their borders, their airspace, their shores. The problem is all of the nations China and Russia are doing business with cannot protect their information space. Here in Thailand, the largest, most popular social media platforms are all based in the US and are all openly and have for years and years been used as a tool to advance US foreign policy in each of these countries. So China and Russia need to start thinking about not just exporting weapons to defend the physical domains of these partner countries. They need to start thinking about ways to export the means to defend information space in these partner countries. So that means helping them set up a domestic social media platform the people there can use and decide what information can and cannot be shared there, rather than allowing that decision to be made by Wall Street, Washington, Silicon Valley. They also need to help them create pipelines to create real journalists, real diplomats, real administrators who are going to work for their country, not these people who go to the US on some internship and then come back as basically infiltrators. That's what Wisely, Fulbright, that's what all of these programs, the NED money, USAID money, that's what it's flowing in to do, to create infiltrators, to displace people who hold the interests of their country as a priority, replace them with people that hold Western interests as a top priority. That's what China and Russia can do to help. Just a couple of things off the top of my head.
Yeah, Brian, I want to add. Maybe the question was there's probably two ways. One is actually not to have Western propaganda to mail it into China, but also China in terms of image. This which is related to soft power. And I would say that I think when it comes to communication to the West, China and probably Russia in a minor way is kind of giving up to try to give a good message to the West, because the West is a completely controlled system on propaganda, anti-China propaganda. The budgets, I would just give you an example. There's a bill which is for 5 years, which is only related to China, on demonizing China. It's $1.6 billion for 5 years. That is close to $300 million per year, which is only dedicated on negative propaganda on China, meaning that they could come to us, people like us, that we are doing content, and they could offer us, maybe on a single show, maybe a few $1,000s, or you write articles negative about China. There's a huge budget for that. And China is not going to fight that. They cannot fight because it's impossible. They cannot have any presence in the West. So I would say that the communication when it comes to China is more directed to the non-aligned world, to Africa, to South America, and so on. But I would say not so much communication the way that soft power is used in the West, but I would say it's more by doing tangible things, meaning that they're helping countries, they're building roads, hospitals, and so on. It's more by doing. But sadly, I would say a lot of people are driven by emotions. Yes. And they don't look for facts. So when you say China bad, you repeat it 100 times, but people in the West, they start believing that. They can believe absolutely everything. They've been believing that Russia was bombing its own nuclear power plant. They've been believing that so many of those stories. But because sadly, if you repeat a lie many times, people end up even the most absurd lie, they start believing it.
Yes, that's really important, because China spends all this time, energy, and money building things, tangible things that you can see, that you can visit, and I see this happening here in Thailand, and you can see how trade between Thailand and China is benefiting everyone on both sides. People running entire businesses based on this trade. And people, like, for some reason, that doesn't appeal to ordinary people. Ordinary people, just like you say, Angelo, emotional narratives gets them every single time. The West are the masters at this, which is why in a country like Thailand, if you don't just cut out Western propaganda altogether, there's no way. It doesn't matter how much objectively better your alternative is. The US is always going to be able to convince people of some fiction, some fantasy that is more emotionally appealing or compelling. And that is the unfortunate reality of human nature. And foreign policy has to take into account the reality of human nature. You cannot ignore it. You cannot just say, well, we're doing these things and it's good and people will see it. Actually, no, they won't, because of human nature. They are not going to necessarily see it and react to it the way you think they will. So, I mean, we have to explore a whole spectrum of choices. Here's a question. I probably could do a whole video on this. Do you think communism is the only way to freedom and prosperity of humanity? I mean, if you look at China, China says that it's a communist country, but they use a whole host of policies and methods. They have elements of capitalism, private ownership of property. They have a whole vast array of tools. They look at it as tools. Where communism comes in, and the elements of communism that are serving China best are those elements that place purpose above profit, place society, the system, the nation above profit. So you do not subordinate your country to corporate financier special interests. They are subordinated to the state. They work for the people. Unfortunately, there is no magical way of solving everything. There is no way to establish the perfect government. The way you establish a functioning, rational, responsible government is to create a balance of power within a society and between societies. That is what multipolarism is all about. Angela, you want to add to that? I think you have a lot to say on that also.
Well, Chinese are extremely pragmatic. It's about result. So they studied the best practice when China was about to open up in the 1970s with Deng Xiaoping. They went around the world and they tried to learn from the best practice. And I think this is a very humble way to do that. The West should actually be inspired by that. If people are doing better, you need to follow who's doing well and try to apply with your own characteristic. So Deng Xiaoping had a quote saying that it doesn't matter if the cat is white or black, as long as it catches the mouse, right? In reality, it's like this. China has been using many different tools, adapting to its own level of development, its own historical point where it was, and it's actually adapting constantly. The idea is to achieve the best results. So it's not stuck into communist, and actually it doesn't actually like labor. Communist is actually, people need to be very careful not to fall into a trap to put a label on whatever ideology they have, because it puts people into boxes, it divides people. In reality, you can use different terms, and China used more like a shared prosperity, which is a healthier term, especially because people do not understand what communism is. Most people haven't read Marx. So, but people, if you tell people shared prosperity, I would say that 99% would say, well, that's a good idea. If we can actually have, growth, and that growth is actually shared more equally to the population, that's a better thing. So now the terms, the Chinese government is very pragmatic. It's not stuck into a single ideology. And what remains of communism is more about really how we can share prosperity equally, and so there's this tacit contract between the government and the people about growing, share prosperity, and people are very pragmatic, really. The system has been working for 40 years. It's been working. Why change? And I think it's very culture. You do not sell wind to Chinese. You don't come to China and say, I'm going to give you freedom. Average Chinese would tell you, guess what? Money is freedom, and that's the reality. You have money, you can, that's the most important. It's about tangible, how I can put food on the table, how I can put kids to school, rather than what we have in the West is people are stuck into issues over identity, abortion, church, and so on, and those are distraction. China, people about the real world. It's about really, can I eat freedom? No, you can't. You can't. If you are living in the streets, if that's and you call yourself having freedom, no, it's not. There's a responsibility of having at least basic human rights fulfilled, having a full belly. I mean, that's about dignity, having a house. At least that's about human dignity. And it's about the metrics. Look at the metrics. Everything is positive. The trend is positive. People are happy. Who am I just to judge China? Chinese are happy with the system they have.
Yes, and of course it's not perfect. People have to remember it's a huge country with a huge population, and they know that it's not perfect, and they're constantly working on improving it. But I like what you said there about it being practical and pragmatic, and that is what government should be. It should not just be a giant smoke screen with something hidden behind it and people cannot see it because of the smokescreen of distractions, of wedge issues and political footballs people are kicking around. We're almost done, I swear. We're almost done. There's only two left.
I like the questions. I like the interaction. I think it's a very good. I enjoy actually those shows where you have the community that is coming and we can share ideas. We have questions back and forth, and I see people are excited about this interaction. So I'm glad to join.
So here's one that comes up often. Don't you find it weird that those same corporations are the same people from Israel or Jewish background that want to usher in their biblical apocalyptic prophecies on purpose? What do they mostly all have in common? Is they're all white European descent. That's what most of the U.S. European ruling class all have in common. It's not Jewish people are controlling it. Otherwise, the Americans were going to be super peaceful, benevolent, and it was the Jews that came in and ruined everything. The U.S. steamrolled the indigenous population. They expanded as an empire across the Pacific. They conquered Hawaii, deposed the system there. They subjugated the Philippines. When people resisted, they massacred them. This wasn't Jews doing this. This was America. America did that. White Westerners who call themselves Jewish are a demographic within the larger collective West. But it's not as if they're the ones running everything. Otherwise, everything would be ideal. People really gotta wake up and just go to a board of directors and do the work. Just go through the board of directors of all these companies, and if this is what you're super focused on, go find out what ethnicity or religion they all claim to be, and you tell me what the common denominator is. But people have to. That's another distraction that blinds people to what is going on. So their whole universe is Jews and Israel, and they don't realize the U.S. is doing literally the exact same thing here in Asia with different types of proxies. They're not Jewish or Israeli or Zionist. They're all other manners of ethnicities, religions, ideologies that they are using to do the exact same thing. So again, zoom out, see the big picture. Okay, and last one. This is the last one. Why is it taking so long for BRICS to come up with a decisive alternative to US dollar? What are the obstacles? This is a good question, and it is imperative that there is an alternative to the US dollar. The US has weaponized the dollar and it uses it to subjugate the entire planet. It is trying to use the US dollar to reassert primacy over the planet. I think, Angela, you'll probably agree with me on this. It's the dollar. And U.S. influence is so vast, it has a momentum all on its own. So even if all source of its power ceased today, the momentum of it would continue for years and years. It will take a lot of effort, a lot of hard work to create an alternative and displace the power of the dollar. Angela, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's a misconception here. A lot of people, they think that BRICS is to replace just the current system, that it's about replacing the dollar. It's not. It's about giving other alternatives. So it's open. It's not ideologically driven, but mostly giving alternative. And again, BRICS is not about wishing the collapse of the US economy. It's not about wanting the collapse of the US dollar. Nobody has to win out of this. Even China would be a loser if the US economy collapses. It's nobody's interest. It's about how giving other alternatives, and the fact that the US dollar is being used as a weapon by the US. So I would say people need to look at BRICS as an open box. You want to join in. There are things you pick what you want to choose out of BRICS. And I would say it is about for a lot of countries about regaining their sovereignty, because once you are free to use whatever currency you want, system of payment, then you are actually more regaining some type of sovereignty. Why would you actually pay in a currency which is almost a de facto Ponzi scheme? It's a debt that is not being supposed to be repaid. So at least there's actually being some kind of more prosperity being shared. You're not stuck with the US dollar. You can you have more flexibility to trade in other tools, because we don't know exactly what would be those tools. They are talking about being linked to some type of a cryptocurrency, blockchain, but this will happen, but it is going to be gradual. But again, it's not going to replace anytime soon the US dollar.
Yes. Well, the other thing is, you're talking about the global economy. I mean, again, I was just looking at news coming out of China. Just the Chinese economy is so massive. So when you're trying to change something that is this massive, it just by the scale of it, it just takes a tremendous amount of time to do. Just like you said, Angela, there's so many things connected to the US dollar. It's so deeply entrenched. And like you said, people are not looking to just sabotage it, destroy it, usurp it. It's because the US has been using it for sanctions, using it to punish, isolate, and destroy entire countries. I mean, people across the multipolar world have a sense of self-preservation. They want some kind of alternative to it. So it's something that's going to take time. And I always tell people, if you want to know what you as an individual can do, it's not just about the dollar, but it's about industry, manufacturing, media that you consume, products and services that you can consume. If you can stop directing your money into these corporations and financial institutions that dominate the unipolar world, if you can spend that money locally or spend that money across the multipolar world, it seems like such a futile thing to do, but American primacy has been built by millions of people for many, many years, doing little things every single day. It has all added up. And if we want the multipolar world to come into shape, it's going to take millions and millions of people doing little things every day to add up to a multipolar world. It's not just left to Russia, China, Brazil, Iran, India. All of these countries joining BRICS or lining up to join BRICS. It's not just up to them, it's also up to individual people. And it's also about, if Russia and China are not going to do anything to protect the information space in their partner nations, it's up to people across the alternative media to try to do what they can to achieve this. So I think that's a good place to end it. Angela, do you have any final thoughts? It's 2024 going into 2025.
Oh, I'd like to, on a lighter note, I'd like to wish everybody like a Merry Christmas, whatever. I mean, a Happy New Year. Just to try to be more positive. Sadly we cover a lot of things negative, that might seem negative, but ultimately I would say a positive note. I think those are tensions that are normal. We are not going to be out of work, geopolitical work anytime soon. But I would say that is the nature of the human nature. We need to be positive somehow. There are bumps on the road. Hopefully, there are solutions to be found, and the most important is that there's no bigger confrontation at the global level. But I'm positive that things are going to be well. So I would like to wish everything good, like families, healthy lifestyle, just even though we hear, I actually wish we were covering other topics. It could be like fitness, or could be like space industry. I was doing other things more fun, because this is it seems a bit negative, but this is we try. I would say to people, try to take this as something lighter. It's just, we have bumps, but ultimately, it's important just to stay healthy.
Yes, that's a good point. Actually, I kind of wanted to bring that up, but I don't even know how to approach it. Look, I do geopolitical analysis because there are certain issues that I don't see people addressing, and I just feel the need to inform people, and I don't like doing it. I wish there was, like, my blood pressure was up on the screen so people could see it while I'm talking about these issues, and then they might get a glimpse into how I feel doing this. But there are things that we can do. The alternative media is helping raise awareness. We are in a way forcing, and the multipolar world is forcing the collective West to react. The NED burying all of its funding. Disclosures, I think that is a response to what we have been doing. In addition to that, I think we should think about more positive things we can do locally or collectively to contribute to a better world, not just focus on what is wrong with the world, but focus on what we can do for the world as well. And I learned a lot here in Thailand. The king of Thailand, King Rama IX, had this sufficiency economics that he promoted throughout his entire life. His son promotes it now all across the country. You can see millions of people have benefited from this. And I myself woke up and realized, just as Angela was saying, the West obsessed with all these nonsense issues and like material, practical issues and real work that gets your hands dirty, growing food, making things. This whole world was opened up to me here. I learned that here in Thailand, and I've always wanted to try to share that. So maybe in the next year, and Angela, maybe a topic that you want to talk about, maybe we could try to diversify a little bit. It doesn't always have to be geopolitics, because it takes its toll. I could tell you this year, I've never felt this exhausted. I don't know if it's just like, I don't know, collectively building up, but we'll just try some new things maybe next year. So thank you again, Angelo. Thank you everyone who tuned in. Again, check the video description below for all the places you can find and follow my work, also Angelo's work, also different ways you can help support either one of us. That's all listed in the video description below. Again, thank you, and we'll see you next year. Bye.